Но то, что вот этот Алеша известно Болгарии всей.
Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by problem and what specifically you're referring to. I actually do agree that the framing that's typically done, which is like, an epidemic of unarmed black men getting killed by cops. I agree that's technically the incorrect framing in terms of like, well, we actually don't have very high numbers for that, right? Like something like a couple hundred people killed per year. I mean, that could be bad, but at any given moment, there's so many other things that are actual, like deeper, like existential threats to, for example, the black community. And it's not like violence from cops. That's the thing that's killing, black people most of all, right? So I would agree that technically, like that framing isn't correct. However, um, uh, beyond the issue of like whether or not black people are getting killed by cops, I think first of all we have to say that in terms of police violence against unarmed people, America very much is an outlier, right, in the modern world. Like I think, for example, in Japan, right, and of course Japan has a lower crime rate, but Japan's crime rate is about, let's say, homicide rate is about maybe 5 times as low as America's average. But in terms of police fatalities there, especially like of unarmed people, which by definition will be everybody pretty much, I think the last time was like maybe years and years and years ago. For a population that's not like that drastically different compared to the United States. So like in terms of that differential, we could probably say, maybe we have like a 1,000x differential in terms of police violence that is not explicable just by violent crime itself. Whether or not it deserves to be seen as an existential threat, I think that's open to debate, and you could even say no. But I think the reason why it's framed as like the key issue surrounding all this is like the only way to get people's attention, right? Like this is the only way that people listen. You had, the killing of Eric Garner. People just ignored it. Of course, people were protesting it, but it wasn't really, like there were basically too many people making excuses, right? Here with George Floyd, that's much harder to do because he's just literally like on the ground begging for his life. So that's a lot harder to justify, and people are not, for the most part, justifying it. However, I will say this. Although killings of unarmed black people is very, very rare, like you would be an exceptionally unlucky person to be born black in America and to die at the hands of cops. I think that's true. But everything else is much, 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 wider, and it's, much bigger, and it's sort of talked about, but it's even stuff that's like harder to capture in data. Like, for example, like, when we were growing up, I'm not sure, like what the racial makeup was in your school, but it was very obvious that the way that the cops would treat me when I was like a 16 or 17-year-old versus my like black friends or Hispanic friends, it was incredibly different. Okay, I had friends that were like every single week they would have stories about getting harassed by cops, and it was just insane because it's like, well, I literally can't point to any situations like that in my life, and most white people can't point to anything like that. So we have that. We have the fact that when it comes to something like marijuana offenses, black people are 4 times as likely to be arrested on marijuana possession, not selling, but just like generic possession. Historically, it's a little different now because of what's happening in New York City, but like there's a 4 times difference, despite the fact that black people and white people use and possess marijuana at pretty much the same rates. So is that like, but the thing is, like, you can't have like police reforms, and you can't have like rioting and people giving it all this attention if you talk about, well, cop killings are really not a problem at all, and it's just marijuana. Like, nobody's gonna give a shit. It's like when people ask, why did the killing of George Floyd specifically lead to all these like widespread rioting and all these like plans for changes in the black community. That, by the way, they're going to go beyond just like changes in cops, right? There's going to have to be actual changes in these communities themselves. My answer to that is, like, if you walk down Brownsville or you walk down like, you know, any like black neighborhood and you see like yet another, you know, black homeless guy with his fucking shirt off, drunk and high, like asleep in the sun in like a puddle of his own piss, well, we could all agree that's pretty bad and those things shouldn't happen, but we see it so often that nobody cares. Like, you could literally put up posters everywhere, right? Like, oh my God, why are all the homeless people mostly black and mostly men and mostly look like this and act like this and mostly have all these mental problems? You could put up posters everywhere. Like, you could put up posters on every city block in America and nobody's going to give a shit. But people really do care about, you know, a guy getting murdered on video. Like, they do care about that. They don't care about the homeless guy with his shirt off. But both of those things, they point to some sort of underlying reality, right? Like, if you have this difference in black unarmed men getting killed, or you have this difference in, you know, like marijuana arrests, or you have differences in just kind of like generalized harassment, or generalized, hey, you know, I'm black and a cop has pulled his gun on me like 4 different times in my life and I'm just like a normal law-abiding citizen. Those things point to an underlying reality that needs to be addressed. And every single race riot in American history has specifically started with police brutality. And it's not because police brutality was like the worst thing that these neighborhoods faced, but it was a symptom of, you know, a generalized rot. And it's a symptom that people can respond to very emotionally. And because people are able to respond to it emotionally, that's why you have these movements that crop up around it. Like, I would actually agree with you that, you know, like in general, I think if people understand that, hey, there's this kind of like generalized structural racism, and there's all this other stuff that we need to deal with, like wealth disparities, we need to deal with like concentrations of poverty, we need to deal with the fact that there is still a kind of like de facto Jim Crow everywhere, and we need to eliminate segregation as far as possible, and we have not been doing that. In fact, some of these problems have gotten worse. I agree that that's like the most rational approach, and that's the thing that everybody needs to be like completely fucking like up in arms about. The fact that like coronavirus is like so bad in America, right, and everybody knows it, and we're probably gonna get like 250,000 deaths. Like, people need to be fucking upset that really it's like the rate of black people dying, like of a certain age group, like 10 times worse. That's something that's like a bigger existential threat. But are people really, like, how do you make a movement out of that, right? Like, how could that be the symbol of your movement? You know, there's nothing sexy about it. It's like, you know, it's like somebody getting the flu, right? Or somebody, you know, having no access to food except just like a food desert. So their whole family becomes like slowly, you know, more obese than average, more diabetic than average, has to spend more money on food than the average white family, despite it being a far lower quality food. Like, there's no sexiness there, and nobody gives a fuck. But I agree, those are the existential threats. You know, same thing with like walking down the street. Like, how many people walk down the street and they're scared of like, oh my God, like the biggest threat to me right now is like in this black neighborhood is somebody's gonna jump out and they're gonna fucking shoot me. When in fact, like, the biggest threat to your life is, hey, should I have this donut for breakfast? Yes or no? If the answer is yes, and I do this, you know, 1,000 times in my life, I might, you know, get heart disease and die, or I might get cancer and die. But like, people don't think in those terms, and it's very hard to build a movement, and it's very hard to get people to care. You know, by switching out one symbol for another, and the symbol happens to be like, you know, a donut with a big X on it. Don't eat the donut. Like, you know, you're not gonna get anything out of that. So, you know, I agree. Like, purely in terms of the fatalities, that is overemphasized, and that is just kind of like the wrong frame technically. But so far, it's the only frame that has worked. And if you think that there's like, you know, a better way to deal with, like, let's say not police fatalities, but generalized harassment of black people, generalized discrepancies in stuff like marijuana arrests, despite like, you know, the level of guilt in the white community is equal, and they don't have to share, but they don't have to deal with the same consequences. Like, if you can find me like a better symbol that would magnetize people and that would get like literally like even Republicans right now like trying to pass legislation to deal with this stuff, you know, I'm open to hear what that is. But so far, like, I haven't seen what that is. Like what would be your preferred way of tackling this in a way that, you know, like, honestly, like in a way that people actually like give a fuck about, in a way that politicians give a fuck about, because they didn't give a fuck about anything. Like look back over the last like 50 years and tell me, you know, and tell me the kinds of reforms that we had or didn't have. Like, they didn't care a lot about the stuff, and now they really do, because you can't, on some level you can't deny it, but also you do have to find a way to deal with like this civil unrest, because it's a civil unrest that's been sort of expanding and ballooning in different directions, in different ways for 150 years now. Every single race riot started with some incident of police brutality. And that's true despite the fact that police brutality never was the biggest threat to black lives in American history, right? It has never been police brutality. It's been other things, especially in recent history, you know, when lynchings are now legal. So like what would be your proposed alternative? Like, you know, I'm perfectly fine having this kind of discussion, but I think people miss the point when they say stuff like, well, it's only 200 people that are dead.